Hello, everyone. Welcome to Science Sunday, and Happy Earth Day, too. It's helpful in any mental endeavor, as Scott and I have talked many times, to state one's premises up front. We believe there's no such thing as a bad question. We draw a distinction between this premise and the fact that the number of bad answers is uncountable. We also recognize that science in all its forms, biological, astronomical, geological, psychological, economic, and social, is the only viable means of separating good, accurate, and truthful answers from fantastical, mythological, or just uninformed ones. Science Sunday started in 2012 here at this DuPage Unitarian Universalist Church. We continue to be grateful to the church for providing us a place to meet on the first and third Sundays of each month during the regular church season. We invite you to explore science here and share any knowledge you may have about nature and the cosmos. We also invite you to explore this community of science lovers, many of whom are members of this church. We hope you will find that we are welcoming and warm and generally worth knowing. We suspect you are too. I wanted to make sure that as Scott is talking about evolution and growth of life forms on Earth today, that I wore my special shirt here showing two amazing tetrapods going out for a walk, working together well. This kind of reminds me of the Tiktaalik stories I've talked about, your inner fish, and Charles Darwin, of course, on there too. I've also got my Science Sunday socks on in support of that, and thank you all that are here for enjoying Science Sunday with us. I've had a lot of nice comments on emails and so on from people saying that this is meaningful and helpful to them as they're facing their way through the pandemic. We hope you're staying safe and scientifically logical in what you're doing. Other than that, good luck and thanks for signing in today. We want to thank our healthcare workers and people that are keeping us all safe and well, and I know there's a number of them in this congregation. We thank them as well, too. So without further ado, I want to welcome Scott Thompson to the lecture to talk about another Origins lecture, where we came from. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mike. Well, for the first time, I think, in history, I get to say good afternoon, science lovers. Normally, we say good morning, science lovers, so this is quite a change. I hope this works out for all of you. You know, at my workplace, in the past, we've had these events called Lunch and Learns. So here in the Midwest, it's lunchtime. If you happen to be eating your lunch, don't worry about making loud noises and smacking your teeth together. You're going to be fine. Welcome to all of you who tuned in today, and welcome to those who will be seeing this in the future, thanks to the magic of the internet. So this is part, as Mike has indicated, this is part of a series of talks I've been giving this year based upon a suggestion from Mike about talking about the origin story that could be told and is being told by science. All sorts of traditions exist in the world. Nearly every culture has, if not every culture, has some sort of origin story, from battle of the gods to a conflict between chaos and evil, between order and disorder, etc. And one of the more prevalent origin stories in our culture comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Talks about the earth being, and the heavens and the stars and the oceans and all of life being formed in 6 days. And that's a very interesting story. Some of the things that it recounts seem to be in a plausible order, according to what science has discovered. Certainly life in the seas came before life on the land, but birds, for example, are a late arrival in the story of evolution. You know, over the years, Mike and I have spent quite a bit of time talking about evolution and the science related to the biological changes from DNA to macroscopic evolution of organisms, etc. Today I want to take a slightly different approach to that. I want to talk about especially an emphasis on plant evolution and the greening of the earth. I think that's something we haven't addressed in detail previously. So we'll be making use, once again, of my hypothetical Spaceship Daydream. I'm taking this from the Cosmos series. Neil deGrasse Tyson and Carl Sagan have their spaceships of the imagination. I have invented this notion of the Spaceship Daydream. And so we'll be availing ourselves of this daydream mechanism to imagine what the world might have looked like in the deep past, etc. We've used it previously. We've used this mechanism of daydream informed by scientific plausible explanations to explore such questions as the origin of the universe, the origin of matter, the origin of stars, the way stars live and die, and whatnot. If at any point you have questions or comments today or in the future, you can contact me at a special email address set up just for this occasion and for this endeavor to communicate science and humanism. The email address is displayed here on the slide. It is tscott@humanistchat.org. So feel free to take a note of that and send in any comments and questions. So we talked about how our planet began as an accumulation of dust and gas and what we would today call meteorites or asteroids several billion years ago, about 4 billion years ago. And shortly afterwards, there was a cataclysmic collision between two astronomical bodies that occupy the orbit that the Earth and the Moon currently have. There was a larger body about the size of Earth and a smaller body about the size of Mars, and they collided, and a lot of the lighter material slothed off into space and formed the Moon, which is a slightly different composition through and through to the bulk of the Earth, but similar to Earth's crust. So there's good evidence that the Earth and the Moon were formed from a collision about 4 billion years ago. And then the first several 100 million years of the Earth's existence as an independent entity in the solar system was really a hellish period. Sometimes this is referred to as the Hadean Earth or the Black Earth period. And there were frequent collisions between Earth and additional comets and meteors and asteroids and whatnot. It was just not a very pleasant place to be, at least if you're a modern organism or whether a plant or an animal here on Earth today. But it was during this epoch, the Hadean epoch, or slightly towards the end of that epoch, where it seems plausible that life first got its start. We talked last time about the alkaline undersea vents. These alkaline chemicals percolate up through the crust of the Earth, various hot gases and whatnot. And as they percolate up, they encounter the slightly acidic primordial ocean water, seawater. And the combination of an alkaline fluid and gas with a slightly acidic seawater provides a proton gradient, or another name for this is an electrical voltage or an electrical current that can flow. And anytime you have flowing energy in the universe, that energy can interact with matter, and it typically forms what are called exothermic, spontaneously organized, exothermic, complex dissipative structures. So a hurricane or a tornado is an example of that, where the energy of weather and air and light combine with the material of the atmosphere or the ocean to produce a dissipative structure. Well, this same sort of notion of a dissipative chemical structure could be relevant to these undersea alkaline vents, which analogs of these sorts of vents exist to this day. They're porous, they're relatively mild temperatures, and the idea is that these proton gradients that occurred in these vents could have been instrumental in the formation of replicative biological or pre-biological metabolic processes. Interestingly enough, the energy process of nearly every cell, whether it's a plant cell or a protist cell or an animal cell or a fungal cell, the energy that those organisms capitalize on is powered by protons. You might think in this world of electronics, where we have electron currents powering everything from our phones to our light bulbs to clocks and televisions, that nature would have availed itself of electrical currents. Well, the most primal energy source of life seems to be proton currents, which harkens back perhaps to this ancient epoch when protons were liberated in ancient seas of the earth. Well, how we get from some biological molecules or some pre-biological processes or the replication of simple organic molecules to the complexities of single cells still is largely mysterious. But this is a wonderful opportunity for scientists and explorers to recognize that we just don't know all of the answers, and there's almost infinite possibility for further exploration. However, what is clear is that many of the molecules relevant to life, including RNA, which I'll talk about in just a moment, can form abiotically, just spontaneously given the right chemical and energy and geologic conditions. At some point, some of these globules, one of the things that happens is little lipid membranes form automatically in an aqueous environment, whether it's puddles on the seashore or perhaps even deeper, completely submerged environments. You can automatically get these lipid molecules that form spontaneously in nature, and they tend to form little bubbles, sort of like soap bubbles. And this happens naturally, and at some point some of these replicating and metabolizing molecules became encased instead of in the pores of a rock chimney from one of these vents. It became encased in a lipid membrane and became free-ranging. And then we get to the beginnings of evolution, of biological evolution. It's a continuity between, or continuity between chemical evolution and biological evolution. The same principles apply. Those chemicals that were most profligate, the ones that created the most numbers or the most fecund reproduction of molecules, eventually were the molecules that came to predominate. Similar things happen with life. The ones that are the most successful at replicating and using energy from their environment or shoving aside competitors are the things that survive. And so evolution progressed naturally from chemistry to biology. And much of the history of life on this planet has entailed the ingenious, if you'll pardon the anthropomorphizing, the ingenious mechanisms evolved by microbes to process matter and energy within the environment. Evolution, whether it's molecular evolution or chemical evolution, follows a fairly simple cycle. I call this the engine of evolution. And within this engine, you have adaptation, where this is a famous story that Charles Darwin tells, where an organism adapts to be most efficacious at surviving and procreating in a particular environment. Well, that can lead to environmental changes. If you get a sudden explosion of population, that can either denude the environment of food sources or energy sources, or it could provide an opportunity for predation. In any case, adaptive changes lead to a change in the environment. And a change in the environment causes stresses. And those stresses create selective pressures. Again, the same thing is relevant to molecules as is relevant to biological organisms. And this continuous, never-ending cycle between adaptive change and environmental change and selective pressure change is what drives the engine of evolution. And this engine has been spinning round and round on our planet throughout all the days of the history of this globe since life first emerged. One of the things that life does is it overcomes energy gaps, right? I told you about dissipative structures. They form whenever there's an energy flow. Well, sometimes you have energy available, but in order to avail yourself of that energy, you have to overcome a little bit of, you can think of it as friction, right, in prosaic terms, right? To get something started, the initial push has to be a little harder and firmer than the subsequent energy that you put into something to keep it rolling. Well, the same kind of thing happens with chemistry, and in some sense you can think of this as being applicable to ecological niches as well, where there's some barrier that tries to ensure, well, there I go anthropomorphizing again, there's a barrier that helps ensure that there's not a change of state in the environment, in a chemical solution, or in a biological population. And occasionally, some mechanism can be enlisted that helps lower that energy barrier. In the case of living things, the most common way that that's done is through enzymes. There's a rule in biology that says if there's a chemical process that happens that is relevant to life and living metabolism, eventually an enzyme will evolve to help facilitate that reaction. And over time, we've seen evidence that enzymes become more efficient. However, certain enzymes are locked in a sort of primordial state. Just as an aside, the enzyme known as ribisco is the most prevalent enzyme on planet Earth. And this is an enzyme that's common to all green living things. And one of the reasons it's so common is that unlike other catalytic enzymes, ribisco doesn't, once it does its action related to photosynthesis and whatnot, it doesn't let go of its chemical products very quickly or in an energetically efficient manner. And so plants have to manufacture a lot of ribisco in order to maintain their metabolic processes. But ribisco has been sort of locked in the evolutionary history of our planet. And there are other examples of this where evolved characteristics, whether they're chemical or functional for macroscopic organisms, these same sort of fossil characteristics propagate through time because evolution can only ever take advantage of what already exists. It can take advantage of that on a microbiological level to invent new perturbations and variations on enzymes that can operate on new kinds of chemicals. But when it comes to macroscopic multicellular beings, inventing a whole new organ from scratch, say, is really implausible. There's no handle for evolution to pull up on in that case. Now, speaking about the evolution of life on Earth, especially microbiology sorts of evolution, I want to talk about three specific kinds of rock today. The first kind of rock I want to talk about, you've heard us talk about it before, it's banded iron formations. Back in the ancient seas of the planet Earth, about the first billion or billion and a half so years when the Earth and its oceans existed, the atmosphere would have been what we consider toxic. Would have been full of choking chemicals and no oxygen to speak of. And there was oxygen around. Before oxygen got out into the air, it had an ability to, since it was mostly generated by the chemical processes of aquatic protists, bacteria and whatnot, oxygen accumulated in the oceans. But prior to that, when oxygen was locked up in chemicals such as H2O, water, it turns out that iron can essentially dissolve in water as long as there's not oxygen in the water. And then once these microbes started releasing oxygen by splitting water and using the hydrogen in their metabolic processes, actually it uses the protons out of hydrogen. Remember I was talking about protons. Uses the protons out of hydrogen for some metabolic processes and releases the oxygen. Well, that oxygen would bind to the iron that's in solution in primordial seas, and then that would precipitate out as rust. And so all over the world, if you dig down deeply enough into the historic geologic strata of our planet, you find this layer thick with rust. And that's where much of the iron that is mined for use in our civilization originates, is from these banded iron deposits. My friend Joanne Reed and I and Phyllis Anderson and a couple of others, last summer we had the opportunity to do sidewalk science, and I remember talking to a young fellow who said that he wished he'd have known about fossils when he was working in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, because he worked in an iron mine and he didn't even think to look for fossils, but even if he had, in an iron mine he probably couldn't have found any. And I had the delightful opportunity to explain these banded iron formations to him and told him that the iron that he was mining was the result of the action of some of the most ancient organisms on Earth. Here's another example of these banded iron formations. One of the things you can see in this picture, besides the geologists, is that the strata is laid down in layers. And this is typical of what you see geologically in terms of what's called sedimentary rock. There's igneous rock, which is big globs of material that are belched out by volcanoes, and the other kind of rock typically is sedimentary rock. And then you've got this other strange rock called metamorphic rock. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today. But if you look at the sedimentary layers in this ochre-colored cliff, you'll notice that they're twisted. Well, that's not because this was a hill in the primordial oceans and the iron settled on a hill. It's because geologic time entails the plastic deformation of rocks. Who would think of rocks as plastic? They're able to be deformed without necessarily cracking and shattering to dust. But you apply enough force over a long enough period of time, and even rocks can bend like putty. And we see evidence of this globally in terms of the bent and folded strata that's encountered by geologists. This is another indirect indication of the vast age of the Earth. If these forces had been applied quickly, these kinds of folds and bends could not have happened. So here we are in our Spaceship Daydream in this hypothetical ancient shallow sea, and we see that the first protists arise. You've got, as I said, you've got bacteria and archaea, and these things had the world to themselves for billions of years. Eventually, an amazing thing happened where something called an archaea ate, I use that term reservedly, ate a bacteria, but did not digest it. And scientists, including Lynn Margulis and others, believe that this endosymbiotic event was the beginning of what we call eukaryotic cells. And these are cells with a nucleus. I want to point out something that I think is really spectacularly interesting about these single-celled living things, though, the eukaryote and I think this is a bacterium pictured here. You see those little dots scattered around in both sorts of cells? Those little dots are ribosomes, and ribosomes are the protein factory of living things everywhere on Earth. And there's something really cool about ribosomes, at least one thing, possibly many. And one of these many things is that a ribosome is made mostly out of RNA. The machine itself is built out of RNA. And what does this machine do? It reads information encoded on strands of RNA. So the DNA in the nucleus is copied by these little, they're called messenger RNA that come outside of the nucleus. And these little bits of RNA are sort of templates of the DNA stored inside the nucleus. And it's these RNA that do the work outside the cell. The RNA in the ribosome machines conspire with these floating bits of RNA messages emitted from the nucleus, and they read these messages. And then there are other kinds of RNA floating around in the cytoplasm of a cell called transfer RNA, and these RNA bind to amino acids. Well, amino acids are formed naturally by chemistry everywhere in the universe. There's been evidence of amino acids in interstellar clouds, and there's been evidence of them in the detritus from a comet's tail and whatnot. But in any case, these RNA machines read RNA programs and then use these programs to latch on to other bits of RNA floating around in the cell that have amino acids attached to them. And this is the way proteins are synthesized. So the existence of this RNA machine in every living cell of everything on Earth speaks volumes about the biological and chemical legacy of the ribosome as being perhaps one of the most ancient and most necessary pieces that goes into putting together the puzzle of life. In any case, you have these protists, these single-celled organisms. Eventually, they tend to live in colonies. I think Mike Winter previously, a couple years ago, had a wonderful talk about speculations regarding the first multicellular organisms. Some of the first plausible multicellular organisms were cnidarians. CN is how that word starts. It's pronounced rather deceptively, but cnidarians like jellies and whatnot, had a kind of a bag-like body plan rather than the tube-like body plan that we and nearly all other living animals have. And these soft-bodied organisms were common in the Ediacaran geologic era, which just preceded the Cambrian geologic era. And it was during the Cambrian that some of the weirdest and most wonderful life forms that have ever existed came into being, like this thing called the Anomalocaris. This is a National Geographic or a BBC film of an Anomalocaris. How they got a camera to go back 500 million years or so is a mystery to me. I've heard that this might be computer graphics. I'll let you and your skepticism decide between those two options. But you'll see this thing, the conventional wisdom is that it hunted trilobites on the ocean floor. Some others think that it was just an eater of more soft and palatable things rather than the hard-shelled trilobites. But eventually scientists may figure out the answer to that particular ecological puzzle, and they may not. It's hard to make definitive conclusions given a fairly scant fossil evidence. But during the Cambrian period, some of the things that we associate with life today became common, such as an axial bilateral body plan, the evolution of eyes from photosynthetic or photosensitive spots on bacteria and whatnot. There's a wonderful way to explain the evolution of eyes without having a miraculous jump from nothing to a lens and a retina and all that. You can see, even in the extant organisms available for study today, you can see all kinds of intermediate capabilities when it comes to photosensitivity and image formation, and just being able to distinguish light from dark of itself is an interesting evolutionary benefit. So at this time, during the Cambrian, essentially all life was in the ocean. There was possibly some bacterial life on the earth, on the surface of the earth, and on shores and whatnot. But certainly macroscopic organisms were all in the ocean. And then, not too long after that, you had these moss-like entities that formed the first greenery on the planet. Before that, you had perhaps lichens that break down rocks with their strong chemical compounds that they emit. You can have lichens that over, I don't know, 10,000 years or more might make an inch worth of powder, rock powder, or clay from rock. But evolution finally enabled some organisms to find their way out of the ocean onto land, and these were moss-like entities. Whenever you look, speaking of life on land, whenever you dig down in soil, oftentimes you'll see this topsoil layer followed by clay, hard clay. Well, clay is the result of weathering in our environment. Mountain rocks and the action of lichen and whatnot will produce silts and clays and sands. And without biological material, that kind of dirt, it's hard, I won't call it soil, I'll resist the temptation, but that kind of dirt is the common kind of particulate matter that you find on the surface of Earth. It takes the addition of biological material, detritus of decaying plants and whatnot, and the castings, which is what's worm poop, by the way, is called castings. The castings of worms, etc., enrich and create topsoil. So topsoil is a relatively late arrival on the surface of the Earth. Here's an example of this ancient fungus from about 420 million years ago. Cooksonia was the name of this, if I'm saying it correctly. Again, you can, there's my email address for this chat. You can contact us if you need, or if you're curious about something that I've said, etc. This Cooksonia grew about that tall. And that was the first forest on planet Earth. And here's a video some scientists from, I believe, University of Colorado have made this. These are just stones laying here on a, perhaps a sandbar or a bit of rocky earth. And if you zoom in with this video, you see this Cooksonia organism, this fungus-like organism, that sprouts into these large carpets. And there's some fossil evidence for this, but like many fossils of soft-bodied organisms, it's very difficult for these to be preserved in the fossil record, but we believe that this constituted the first forest on Earth. The first forest was just a few inches tall. Well, from these beginnings, humble though they may have been, eventually we got these giant mushroom stalks. I sometimes wonder how these tasted. Prototaxites. And these things were 5 meters tall, 6 meters tall. We went from having forests that were inches tall to having these towering stalks of fungus. And this was the second sort of forest that was on dry land. And it was about when this transitioned into taller sorts of trees that I'll describe here in a moment. It was during the transition period when trees and forests started taking off on land that we first see this thing crawling ashore. This is a representation of Tiktaalik that Mike was talking about earlier and has talked about in prior Science Sunday events. So Tiktaalik first waddled ashore sometime around this epoch. And it wasn't too far into this Devonian period when animals began laying hard-shelled eggs instead of the soft-shelled eggs that are common for purely aquatic biomes. So the evolution of land-based tetrapods is coincident with the formation of the first forests. And these first forests had trees that you would not recognize. These would be an alien shore were you to scavenge along it somehow magically. These trees typically just had two big branches, and then each of the two branches would branch off into two pair, and then two pair. It was a very binary kind of tree. Fascinating, almost mathematical in its simplicity. And these trees did not have the same, what is it, xylem and phloem? They only had xylem, so their inner strength, their structural strength was relatively limited, and their roots were fairly shallow, and these trees were prone to blowing over and breaking. And it was a very alien sort of world. It was during this epoch when we saw the first insects evolved from arthropods, things like trilobites and crabs and shrimp in the ocean, eventually took flight, literally, and some of them came onto land as scorpions and eventually spiders and whatnot. So the land was first populated by both plants and animals that were macroscopic in this sort of Devonian era. And then here's an example of that tree that I was talking about. If I can say this word correctly, I believe it's lepidodendron, and also called scale trees. If you look at a pineapple today, you notice one of the things about a pineapple is that those little diamond-shaped external parts of a pineapple often are left there by little branches that break off as the pineapple is growing. And the same kind of thing is thought to have happened with these trees, that as they grew, the branches broke off over time, and it left behind these diamond-shaped scars. And for many years, and even today, amateur paleontologists or people who are not educated about the lepidodendron trees think that this might be dinosaur skin. Well, it's not dinosaur skin, it's the thick bark using that would provided this structural support. Unlike the woody trunk of modern trees, the support of these things was mostly from the thick bark. And as you see depicted here, the roots were very shallow, and so they were prone to toppling over, leaving a forest that would look something like this, just all sorts of dead wood, if you can call it wood, lying on the ground. And one of the most interesting things about this brings me into the talk, the part of the talk where I wanted to discuss the second incredible rock that provides evidence of evolution on our planet. So lignin is one of the proteins that is a common element, a supportive element, a structural element of tall plants, including trees and even these ancient precursor trees. And today, when a log falls, such as this picture depicts, when a log falls, bacteria will attack it, and you'll find rotting logs, right? A rotting log is very easy to break. You can break off pieces of it. It turns into sawdust after a period of time because microbes are attacking the lignin and the other long cellulose chains and whatnot, the long proteins that give wood its strength and bulk. But an absolutely fascinating thing happened back in the late Devonian and during something called the Carboniferous era of Earth's geologic history. The microorganisms required to break down this really tough, structurally sound protein had not yet evolved. Now, even though microorganisms had been evolving in the ocean for billions of years, they'd never previously had an occasion to deal with proteins as a potential food source that were so tough that they would be able to be used in trees to provide structural support. So these trees evolved before the microbes evolved that could help decompose them. Now, anthropomorphizing it intentionally a little bit, it's like the microbes woke up one day and said, "Ooh, what's this? I wonder if we can eat it. And they set about, evolutionarily speaking, developing the right enzymes within their own metabolic pathways to be able to take advantage of this relatively poor but still net positive food source. Well, one of the implications of this is that we had a whole bunch of these proteins from these easily toppled trees and other things like primitive ferns and whatnot, forming a layer of peat in the ancient forests. And this peat, this organic material, was not decomposed. Well, we see the evidence of that to this day when we look in places like Pennsylvania and southern Illinois, and West Virginia and China, other countries that have a lot of coal deposits. In fact, this epoch, or era, one of these names for one of these geologic eras is the Pennsylvanian, because Pennsylvania, as you likely know, has a lot of coal in it, underground and exposed to the surface in some outcroppings, and this coal has been industrially very useful. Well, what happens when you take this fossil coal made up of the biological remnants of trees that did not decompose because the bacteria to do it hadn't evolved yet? You compress this biological material, this peat that accumulates on the ground, and you crush it over geologic time spans, not thousands of years, not millions of years, but tens or hundreds of millions of years of pressure, and you form coal. In fact, there is a coal forest in southern Illinois. There's a coal mine. You can research this on the internet. Look up coal forest, Illinois. And you can find references to this underground mine that is expected to be the largest ancient forest ever discovered on planet Earth, that's still extant to a certain extent. They believe this was the delta area, the muddy regions around a river that rapidly rose and covered this forest with silt. And you can actually find preserved fossils in the coal of these ancient trees, this ancient Pennsylvanian biome. More evidence of the way that life and its evolution has changed the geology, the chemistry, and left traces that we exploit today out of the earth. You know, think about it. You combine coal and iron and you get steel. Our world is largely built of steel. And were it not for the action, or inaction as it may be, of microorganisms, we wouldn't have steel. We wouldn't have iron. We wouldn't have coal. Scientists such as Robert Hazen speculate that the rate of formation of coal during this geologic era was about 600 times the rate of formation today in peat bogs and whatnot. And that essentially 90% of all the coal that's ever been mined or is commercially exploitable on the planet originates from this epoch with its decided lack of a certain kind of microbe. So life continued to evolve subsequent to this as more photosynthetic organisms became ever more fecund on Earth. You had a liberation of a vast amount of oxygen. Oxygen, I think, Mike, you can probably correct me, is it something like 31%? During the Carboniferous period, oxygen got up to something like 31%, whereas it's like 21% today. And it was during this epoch that they had dragonflies, or relatives of dragonflies, that were as big as your forearm. Just astonishingly large insects, because insects largely respirate through their skin. And if there's more available air, oxygen in the air, the trade-off between body weight and the amount of oxygen for fuel that you can absorb from the air, that equation is improved if you have a higher oxygen density. So this is, the fossils of these giant insects is one of the indirect clues that the early Pennsylvanian earth had a higher oxygen content. There are other ways to find this same information. And this is one of the things about this kind of science, is there's many pathways that lead to the same conclusions about age and chemistry and biota and evolution. And if ever one line of evidence disagrees with another, it's the sign of a great opportunity for scientific discovery, because some of those lines of evidence that don't agree must be wrong, or the conclusions we've drawn about the evidence must be wrong. So after this epoch, we get to the more familiar era of the dinosaurs and whatnot. You see the dinosaurs and the pterodactyl, and rain falling and whatnot. And this is all the result of this engine of evolution that I talked about earlier. Again, this applies just as well to the way chemicals evolve new capabilities, new metabolic and structural capabilities. It also applies to the way microorganisms evolve new capabilities, such as, hey, look at that new lignin protein sitting there. I wonder if there's a way that we can evolve an enzyme that allows us to digest that, right? I'm personifying it, but evolution exploits ecological niches naturally. And it's the same engine operating over vast scales that have given us things like the coal deposits and the iron deposits we see in the world. One of the fundamental rules of geology, in fact, perhaps the most fundamental rule, you might call it the first law of geology, is the law of superposition. And this law holds that as you go deeper in Earth, you find older things. Now, specifically, this applies to stratified rock that's laid down in depositional layers. You can certainly have incursions. You can have older rock incurring into younger rock, putting a tongue of itself or a slab of itself. Or you might have a metamorphic or an igneous, a lava that comes into an area that was laid down previously. So you can sometimes find layers of rock on top of each other where the time sequence has been reversed, but those all have very well understood, reasonable scientific and natural explanations. Nowhere, not ever, not once in the history of geology or paleontology has it been found that an older, earlier strata has a completely unexpected emergent sort of fossil, let's say. You won't find a beaver, the fossil of a beaver, in the Pennsylvanian era, right? You won't find a fossil of a dinosaur in recent rock, right? If, in fact, you find some precursor, it's usually what's known colloquially as a missing link. In fact, Tiktaalik, the critter that Mike and I and others have talked about to such an extent, was actually a predicted fossil. It wasn't that somebody went randomly digging somewhere on Earth and said, hey, here's a fish that's got a forearm and it's got a radius and an ulna and it's got the wrist bones similar to the way a mammal or a tetrapod like a dinosaur would have. No, the scientists who discovered this said there must be some transitional period between a lobe-finned fish and a tetrapod, and according to the rules of evolution, this intermediary should have the beginnings of a radius and an ulna and a femur and wrist bones and whatnot. Let's look at the geologic record and figure out when this should have happened. And now let's look at stratigraphic maps of the surface of the Earth and figure out where on Earth that kind of strata from that predicted age is accessible on the surface. And they went there and they looked, and lo and behold, they found it. This was a prediction of the theory of evolution. It predicted what might be colloquially deemed a missing link, and that link was discovered. So this idea that you can date rock by the fossils that are found in it is actually used all the time by geologists. These fossils, these dating fossils, help identify the chronology of rocks. It helps link geologic epochs across the planet. It helps show related biomes, whether an ocean biome, a land biome, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact that older fossils and older rock are deeper in the stratigraphy is relevant to the way the science of geology and paleontology occur. Another rock that was formed through evolutionary processes is limestone. Look at how prevalent limestone is in our world. We use it for concrete, and we use it for building material. Here you see it naturally, and it's in situ, as it were, in the White Cliffs of Dover. This kind of rock, this limestone rock, was predominantly formed by creatures that evolved in the Cretaceous and later that had hard shells that took dissolved carbonates out of the water and formed bony structures or shells and whatnot. And this is another commercially, contemporarily relevant asset. The amount of trade in value in terms of dollars spent on a resource, the amount of dollars spent on limestone vastly exceeds the amount of dollars spent on gold globally, because it's a much more utilitarian mineral. So let's get back for a moment to this idea of stories of origins. Now, you can imagine a place where every kind of living thing that has ever been exists at the same place and time. Now, there's no evidence anywhere in the geologic or fossil record for this, but you can imagine it. In the medieval epoch, or the medieval era of the current epoch, people imagined that the animals that they saw around them every day, lions and llamas and tigers and horses and whatnot, existed all at the same time in the same place. Well, these are all organisms that are contemporary and that are still around, except for a few that have gone extinct. And one of the most prominent creation myths holds that human beings were there as well, even though human beings are latecomers in the geologic record. The lineage that has led to humans has only started evolving in the past, well, they were evolving for billions of years like every other organism on Earth, but the primates are a lineage that's about 2 million years old, and Homo sapiens, us, we're only 100 to 200,000 years old. But one of these creation myths says that here we are in this garden with all living things, and there's this apple tree, and somebody takes a bite of an apple, and it has deleterious consequences. Well, let me tell you something about apples. Apples are a member of the flowering plants, the various species of flowering plants that exist in the world. And those flowering plants are only about as old as the dinosaurs. Prior to this epoch, 400 million years prior to this, we only had conifers and ferns and other sorts of plants that reproduced via spores instead of from seeds. And then flowering plants came along, and along with flowering plants was an incredible explosion of diversity in insects and pollinators. And then the ice ages came along, and these particularly tasty kinds of flowering plants, the oranges and pears and apples and whatnot, tended to favor temperate climates, not necessarily tropical climates. But the ice ages of the last 13,000 years, 50,000 years or so, put a lot of these nutritious plants in jeopardy. And it's believed that almost every species of fruit that we use commercially, in terms of the stone fruits and citrus fruits, survived in a protected valley in what is today China. That some of the mountains around this area sort of held back some of the glacial influx. And so many of the fruits you eat today owe their continued existence to a fluke of geography and geology and climatology, having survived in China. Now, this story is not told in any myth that I'm aware of. But think about how this enhances the story of the apple. How science, by studying the genetic legacy of the radiation of these fruits over the planet Earth and tracing back to the first primordial apples and citrus fruits and whatnot, have been able to discover facts about the lineage of the food we eat, using some of the same scientific methodology that is used to uncover secrets of ancient life that is no longer around. Every fruit and flower you've ever bitten or beheld is a late arrival to the spectacle of life on Earth. But it's not as new as you. Only 200,000 years has our species been around. One member of our species, this fellow named Isaac Newton, saw, proverbially, perhaps mythically, saw an apple fall from a tree near his property when he was under sort of house arrest because of a disease outbreak. Some of you will be familiar with that story. And when he saw this apple fell, he drew a conclusion between the fall of an apple straight down toward the ground and the orbit of the moon in a circle. What a leap of imagination to be able to connect the same force pulling on two disparate bodies. Isaac Newton was a genius whose insights might have been spurred by a fortuitous event involving an apple. And speaking of fortuitous events, this man is one of the people who started us down the road of unlocking many of the natural history secrets of this story. It's Charles Darwin who said something like, from one form or from many or a few, as the world is kept turning in its orbit, new species of life are being, were being, and continue to be evolved. As the world has gone spinning over billions and billions of years, that cycle, the engine of evolution, has spit off new species, many of which have come to a dead end. But you're here today, and you are the inheritor of nearly 4 billion years of successful evolutionary progress. You should feel proud, and I'm glad you're here today. Thank you. Any questions or comments on the email?
None came in.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me and Mike today. And Mike, did you have a question or comment?
I just was going to say that it seemed like your discussion of the layers of the rock there seemed like you were taking a pretty much of a bedrock position about that.
Yeah. It's foundational in its import.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much. We have plans for seeing you again in 2 weeks, and some of the things Scott talked about today have spurred some interest in me. I know I was looking into the possibility of talking about Isaac Newton and what things he did while he was under quarantine, and I thought that could be an interesting topic. And I'm also trying to get to the DuPage County Health Department and asking them to come in and talk again, too. I think that'd be of value. So those are 2 potential things coming up in the next 2 weeks from now. Everyone be safe out there, and it's great to hear all the comments we hear from you and that you appreciate what we're doing. So thanks so much, and thanks again to the AV team and Steve Cooper. Have a great day, and we'll be back.
Bye-bye.